get moving on panel 4, I want to introduce Nicole Fisher. Nicole is going to be our moderator for this panel, and Nicole is involved in lots of things. Brain Treatment Foundation, Health and Human Strategies, and she writes for Forbes. And Nicole's got a lot of background in philanthropy and in sports, and does a tremendous job bringing groups together and really reaching out to at-risk populations and getting them involved in lots of health. So, Nicole.
Since we're a little bit behind schedule, all right, great. So I'm going to have the panelists come on up. I have one thing to note, which is we are missing a panelist. Randy, unfortunately, is local and in the suburbs. There was a death in the family, so he will not be here. But I'm sure if there are lots of questions, he'll be happy to engage with us later. So there will be 4 of us. So closest to me, this is Katie Wilkes. She's co-founder of Free Heart Creative, which is also based here in Chicago. Next to her is Marianna Whitehurst. She's on the board of directors for Georgia Playworks, foundation board of the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame, and the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl Advisory Board. And you guys did a wonderful job last year, by the way. And then at the very end is David Jacobson. He's the founder of Inkflow Communications and is joining us from California. Thank you guys. All right. Well, that was a great keynote. And I think a perfect segue into some of the things we're going to talk about. It was fascinating for me to hear Angela's background. And one of the things that really stood out for me was like, we're all in the same space, and yet at least like completely different ways that we come into working in sports. Like my background's in neuroscience, and my doctorate's in health policy. And so somehow, right, we ended up in the same space where I work with lots of athletes and the Super Bowl and all these things. And I thought, it actually really ties to exactly what we were talking about, which is storytelling. Because at the end of the day, we're all weaving a narrative. And so the things I really want to make sure we stay focused on is that you have active takeaways to apply to yourself in how to tell a good story. Every organization has a story, and every organization is a business. And I want to drive that home as we get started, because a lot of people tend to think of nonprofits as not being a business. But you have to raise money. And you have to have money to stay open and to engage the communities that you want. And that starts with telling your story. So Katie, you're closest. I'm going to start with you. I think one of the first things that we have to talk about is defining your audience. So I know it's kind of broad, but I'd like to start with, how do you find your audience? How do you target people? And earlier we were talking about data. How do you get into those things of who should we target, how, when, why? How do you define an audience?
If you were to ask me, I think this is the single most important question that you can ask up front.
You told me that one?
And you did, so thank you. No, really, I think, when I work specifically with nonprofits in a close capacity, that is one of the first 3 questions. That's the one that comes first, is who are you talking to? And why are you choosing to tell this story? Similarly to, why did you start your organization, your nonprofit? And I think it sounds very simple. Oh, we're talking to, as Angela actually said in the keynote, some people think, it's everybody. I want to help everybody in the world. It's very heart-centered, that's very nice, but it's not true. You can't make the most impact if you don't know your very specific target audience. I once had a colleague who was probably 20 years my senior, and he looked at me very directly, and we were talking about a campaign that he was launching, a very specific project, and I said, cool, for us to help get the word out for this communication, who's your target audience? And he said, well, it's everybody in the world. And I go, no, it's not. It can't be everybody in the world. That's very nice of you, but it's not, because the more specific that you can actually drill down and say, okay, it's female, age 19 to 43, who live in Chicago, who are adamant about sports, get as clear and specific as you can, because it makes it incredibly easier to go and reach those people. You might not know who your target audience is. And to that I say, take the time to back it up, hold things like focus groups, take the time to really get into their minds, because once you know exactly who you're talking to, the story that you craft for a gala is not going to be the same story that you craft for your social media, which is not going to be exactly the same cookie cutter thing that you put on your newsletters, right? Or how you speak on a panel. So take the time, and it's going to be different for every organization, and you might have 2 or 3. You might have a couple buckets, but you have to get to know that.
So I like that you said, like, women this age and this age who like sport. But I would think it's also constantly evolving, right? I mean, when we're looking for who are the high donors, who's gonna send in money, it's no longer let's target the old white men, right? I mean, who we engage, who we target, and who's going to help us have the impact we want is constantly evolving. So how do we follow and or seek out that right audience, that right community? So I feel like you're looking at me.
I am. You know, one of the things that we try to do on, and thank you for commenting on the Peach Bowl. I want to ask super quick. Do I actually have any Michigan fans that are here today? Because I know we're kind of close to Michigan. Nobody is a Michigan.
That was like the weakest ownership ever. He literally ducked while he raised his hand.
Wait, where was my Michigan guy? Wait, okay, listen, that's not how you guys showed up for the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. Like, I just want to give you a shout out right now because we loved how Michigan came and unfortunately you didn't win the game, but you know, you did win all the social challenges the entire week before, just so you know. But yeah, so one thing that the Chick-fil-A Bowl actually does do is that we're reaching out to everybody who is a football fan. And I feel like this particular year, because we had Michigan and we had Florida, and those two fan bases have vastly different cultures, okay? But we had a great event in Atlanta. We had 0 fights, which was awesome. We had a bunch of people who came in and they wanted to cheer for their teams. And it was just this wonderful mix of every demographic you can think of. So one thing I think the Peach Bowl does especially well with their content on social media and in every way they present themselves is that they are inclusive and focused. Because when you only target one group of people, you're gonna limit your growth. When you limit your growth, you're also gonna limit your donor base. You don't wanna do that. Do you? The answer
No.
is no. No, certainly you don't want to do that. And I'm not a big analytics person, but I am from the state of Georgia, and I have the opportunity to serve the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame board there as well. And I will tell you, one thing that we love very much in Georgia besides football is golf. So when you look at the game of golf, and you're looking at where golf is growing, it is not in, as Nicole said, the old white men demographic. We've maxed out there. So when we're trying to grow golf, we don't want golf to die, right? Do you guys know what happened in Georgia earlier this year?
Of course.
Okay, where's my of course? What was it?
Tiger winning the Masters again.
Okay, so that was actually not what I was going for. But thank you, that was a good answer because Tiger came back and Tiger is an extremely dynamic and vibrant part of golf. But what I was actually getting at is that earlier this year at the Masters, a women's amateur, it's first ever women's amateur tournament and what you saw right there on golf, right there on national TV, was you saw 2 young women competing against each other and supporting each other at the same time. And that is a story that is going to carry the LPGA for a very long time and help them grow. Because if you looked in the audience, they have a whole new population that they can market to. Whole new population. You want me to shut up yet?
I was just thinking when you also mentioned like data, if Randy were here, I know he would definitely talk about things like as you seek out your audience, using things like Google Analytics, using different types of feedback. You can see who clicks and opens newsletters, who actually follows through and donates, the big donations, the small donations. And so he would very much talk about how to, pay attention to what's coming back at you, about how to grow and target that audience. So I want to take just a slight shift. Now I'm definitely looking at you, because so we find our target audience. And something that you have said, and I just loved, was about how storytelling, when you start to reach out to them, it's an art and a science. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so within an organization, like I consult to a number of nonprofits, mostly involved in youth sports, other forms of youth development and education. And every individual within the organization and every individual that the organization impacts is potentially a story, right? Like every person has a story. So if you're impacting, 500 people or 1 million people, you've got 500 stories or 1 million stories. The science part of that is having systems in place to get those stories coming to you. And so one of the things I'm advising, and there's a sheet in your bag about this, is almost embed a journalist. Like have your marketing person, if you're a small nonprofit, you've got like one marketing guy or gal, embed them as a journalist. Charge them with seeking out stories within your organization or those whom your organization impacts. And create systems and make it as easy as possible for those people to share their stories. Incentivize them to share their stories and use YouTube and use email and use social media as an intake to get those people to invest their own hearts and souls into your organization, your brand, your mission. So that's the science part of it. The art part of it is that journalist who understands what is going to trip the wires of whichever audience you're trying to leverage. So it's different for a donor than it is from a mom. Like you want more moms to bring their kids to your event, that's one thing. You need that one big donor that you know is a sucker for crying kids or whatever, then that's the story that you get. And so you have to have an understanding that that's the hard part of it, is getting to what is going to trip the wires of that we need tripped.
What kinds of stories are most effective?
I'll start. I'm sorry. Emotion, because it's such a raw, basic answer. And for example, I loved Angela's story about the guy who just had his rights restored, and it was a natural story, right? It's a single individual focused person who was on a journey that was immediately understandable. So anything that is that simple and that emotional, it can be digested to a soundbite and is ready for social media.
I also want to jump in here and say that it's such a key element is emotion, but I also think that it's incredibly hard to define it sometimes. It can be overwhelming. We know we want emotion, how do you get the emotion? And what I often say to my clients and the folks that I'm working with is, there's this empathy buzzword that's going around right now. Empathy, you have to connect with the emotion, but how the heck do you do that? And it can be really hard because what you think is the most sicky sweet, oh, tears, this is gonna make him cry, right? We all say we wanna make him cry. Might fall totally flat on the face. And there's this rule of thumb that I'm gonna be pretty real right now. If you are creating the story or your team is creating the story and in the process, you do not feel anything putting this together,
Throw it out.
don't use it. Because it's like this, some kind of like, oh, I'm exempt, like, oh, this is gonna really make me cry, but I don't feel anything crafting this. Take it out. And I think it's this thing that's never talked about really, is like, oh, we assume, but your audience is not dumb, they're really smart. And if you don't feel anything, they're not gonna feel anything either. And it's drawing that line of what is one single emotion that you can relate to with your audience, not necessarily experience. If you're targeting, hungry children, and if your athlete's like, we wanna help hungry children, and you're trying to say that, okay, here's exactly what the message I'm gonna say, and here's what, every child doesn't have to be hungry, you don't have to be hungry to relate to that, but you have to bring out one specific emotion to make them feel, and then in turn want to donate.
I was, because I don't actually execute the strategies. I tell my interns because they know how to do all that back-end Facebook stuff that confuses me. But what I do tell them is like, look, here's what we're going for. I want to make people identify with this. And if I can't make them want to be part of it, if I can't make them want to feel included or look at it and say, you know what, I see myself in that. So then forget it, like we did a bad job, start over. So if you don't laugh or you don't cry, or ideally you would do both, Like you would look at it and it would make you feel sad, but it would maybe also make you like smile a little and identify with that. Be like, yeah, I feel that way sometimes too.
I like that word identify. I mean, I think it's all good movies, like all characters that you identify with them in some way. Like you're going
Right,
on a
you're rooting
story
for them.
with them.
You're
Exactly.
rooting for
This is
them.
no
So
different.
you identify with that. You see something in whatever it is that we're telling, whatever story it is that we're telling, you see something in that sense yourself.
An interesting place, as you were saying, I was also thinking in some of my most successful stories, thanks to Forbes, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a really bad thing, but I can see like what does well where. And when I write stories, I often start with something in the realm of statistics. That I call it the holy shit moment. Like people, so you only have like 2 sentences to get people to either like stay with you or not. And so sometimes it's presenting like, holy shit, I had no idea that many children were hungry. I had no idea that situation had occurred. And all of a sudden it's like, they want to know more, they want to learn more. And in short bursts, those can be very effective too.
I also think, I want to bring up the topic of stats, because I think you hit something that everybody says we need to bring up and show the impact we're going to make and show the problem, right? Here's the problem, here's the solution. One mistake that I see over and over is there's a difference between a compelling stat and numbing out with stats.
Very good point.
And if you are relying on the numbers themselves to tell your story, it's impossible, because guess what? We get bombarded with information all day long, every day, in a million different places. So if you come out and you're leading with 50,000, blah, 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 100,000, blah, 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 can you believe it? Well, yeah, I can, because I'm basically seeing numbers all day long.
Mhm.
So what I say is flip it. Start with one very compelling story that people can identify with, tell it well, spend time on it, and use that as an example to say, can you believe this story? This person is one of 100 million going through the same thing. Whoa. It's just a different way to really.
Katie just said it for me. I'll amplify a little bit though, because again, that's part of the art of it, is you gotta find that one kid or that one mom or whatever, who's camera ready, who can talk, but it has to be authentic, and you can't plant that sort of thing. So you find the one person, but make sure it's a real person with a real story, who is gonna get it across. However, roughly it may need to be gotten across, but in a way that's compelling, so that you can transition that in. And this is why I would say embed a journalist who knows how to transition from, this is Marianna's story, and last year we served 500,000 Mariannas thanks to your contributions.
Thanks for calling me out there, man.
So
What's so funny? I was actually thinking when you were talking about Forbes, and you have 2 sentences, because what we found in trying to reach younger, right? So Forbes, well, that's a great format. But when I'm trying to talk to somebody who's like 17, like that Gen Z generation, I don't have 2 sentences. I have 5 emojis. Okay, so I'm looking at, okay, like I know you don't want to hear that as a journalist, but for real, so if I'm trying to tell them something, what I'm going to tell them on Instagram, I'm not going to tell them in 2 sentences. I'm going to do a Gary Vaynerchuk. Like there's going to be, does anybody follow Gary? Considerably less swearing, but yeah. So I'm going to do a Gary Vaynerchuk. There's going to be a picture, 5 words, and underneath it, it's going to be a lot of hashtags and 3 or 4 emojis, because that's how they communicate.
So actually, I don't use emojis. I mean, I do a text, but I've actually started doing something in this vein, which is I write the first paragraph, and then I embed a very short YouTube video, and I hate it. Like nothing makes me sweat profusely and get really nervous other than turning a camera on myself. But I'll actually just, once I write the article and I do the interviews and it's fresh, I'll literally just sit down for like 3 minutes. I'm like, you're not gonna read this. Here's what you need to know about human trafficking. And so even
And they aren't reading.
But
they are
consuming
content.
Oh, yeah,
They
they're
are
consuming
content
content voraciously.
These little videos, these little sketched out, one's just a chalkboard. It did better than any of the others, and I was shocked. But I knew they weren't reading. So I can get them to click. That's
what you're after.
So actually then I want to flip that on its head. How not get lost in the chaos. So if you only get a few emojis, if you only get a couple sentences, that art and science piece with all the noise, all the different media platforms, engagement strategies, how does your voice and message not get lost, especially for a small nonprofit that's just wading into new territory?
Well, you are gonna get lost to a point because that's why you have to know your audience.
Thanks.
No, it's true. It's, like you might think you're getting, oh, I only got 4 likes on this one. We really wanted 25, but are those 4 going to actually turn into business for you? Are those 4 going to actually donate to you? They might. And that's what often I actually have to keep in mind myself as a business owner is, okay, remember, who am I targeting? Who am I targeting? And if I am slowly and steadily reaching that you can see through things like Google Analytics, then you're making progress. But at some point you do have to kind of accept that there's a whole sea out there, like you said, Nicole, and things are gonna get lost, but those one message that you need to know so clearly, what is it that you want them to do? What is that call to action, and make it as simple and easy for them to do it within the first 5 seconds. Maybe it's through emojis, maybe it's through the YouTube video, maybe it's through something completely different. But I think there's a part of acceptance, but there's also, when I think about how the brain is wired, we are hardwired to pay attention, and you probably know this so well, more than I do, to pay attention to bad news. The amygdala is a very powerful thing.
We get really excited.
Oh yeah. And you are wired to say, oh no, I detect a threat. Oh no, this is gonna affect me. Oh my gosh, what bombing just happened? Oh my gosh, what terrorist act just happened? Those are the things that you're gonna pay attention to, and it makes it extra hard for all of you because you're the ones doing the good work. That does provide hope, that does provide the good things that make people want to act and keep going, and it's real easy to get lost in the negative stuff right now.
So a couple points riffing on that. One is there's a major trend in journalism called solutions journalism, and it's very kind of positive basing journalism, or at least if you're calling out a problem, you're also offering a solution. And it follows a lot of the same rules as normal traditional journalism in that journalists should be providing a balanced outlook and giving multiple voices in the article, but ultimately it is to offer a solution. And there are groups of journalists floating around this and academic exercises. David Bornstein, who wrote the Fixes column for New York Times, is a pioneer in this field with the Solutions Journalism Network. So there are dedicated spaces to positive news. There are people looking for this sort of content, and if you can separate the wheat from the chaff and what you try to put into that system, so that it's not just, it would be nice if we could get this out, versus, wow, this is a story that is going to resonate. And it may not even be exactly the story that you want to tell, but it's so authentic and so impactful on the target audience that it will find its home.
I think that's exactly right. So going off of, the word that comes to mind is fragmentation, I guess, of all the different segments that are out there. How do you, in defining an audience, how do you choose which venues to go after and then sort of stick with? Or is it all in an early plan? Or is it you've got to be really nimble and switch things up? Is it, earlier you mentioned it could be something event-based versus your long-term strategy versus, how do you think about engaging different mediums?
I think if you are, so there's 2 ways I want to go with this. If you're just starting out, or if you're a relatively new organization.
And there are a lot.
And there are, which is why I'm saying it. Start with 1 or 2 things and do them well first, and test them. I said it to Marianna on the way up. I said, I've been playing with this phrase, everything's an experiment, because it takes a lot of the pressure off of, oh no, this fell flat on its face, or oh, this did horrible. Cool, now you know why. Or now you know so much more information of why that didn't work. And if that YouTube video doesn't necessarily over and over again, you try it, you test it, it doesn't do well, now you know, don't use it, try something else. But I think that it's hard for me and any of us to say, always do YouTube, always do this form of social media, because it depends who you're trying to reach and what you're trying to make them do. Somebody asked me one time on a very similar panel, they said, I'm so stuck because we created this amazing video for our gala. It raised thousands of dollars, incredibly successful, and we threw it up on our newsletter and it's fallen flat. But guess why? Does anybody know why?
Everybody at the gala saw the video.
Everybody was in the room. You took all the barriers away from making them sit through it, feel something, because you just took all of those hurdles out of it.
You need a new audience. for
Yeah.
that.
And you need to know how to craft it based on, okay, I have like 15 tabs open on my web browser all the time, every time. How are you gonna cut through that if it's gonna be digital based? So it really depends, but.
I would say that as you try to build these stories though, and let's just use video as an example, just shoot a lot more than you're going to use, because I guess Vine doesn't exist anymore, but the appetite for 6-second videos does. So, shoot 5 minutes for a 30-second video that has 5 seconds worth of content, for the millennials. But get a lot more material than you're going to use and find ways to repurpose it. So if you can shoot one video for 10 minutes and have it hit 5 different channels in 5 different ways, that'll work for you.
That's excellent. It's very smart. So a bit more into the weeds on execution, right? So we talked sort of got to do these things, but at the beginning I started by saying we want everyone to believe and apply things. So there are some newer startups in here. There are people that work for long existing organizations. And one of the things that I think is really difficult is, so say you found your perfect audience, you found that perfect form of media, and it's going great at the gala. You raise a ton of money. How do you extend, and I'll start with you, Katie, how do you think about extending the shelf life of a message or story?
I love what Randy just said by basically having this idea that you're going to use one story multiple ways. You should actually plan to, because it's a lot less effort on you and your staff, but also you're gonna hit and maintain a lot more for your content calendar in the next several months if you are planning that way. So when we talk about extending the shelf life, a lot of us say, I want a video, I want it for the gala, I might spend $10,000. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of money for a nonprofit. It is a lot of money. But you want to be able to repurpose it, because not all that $10,000 you want to be for one single very specific event audience and then it's null. So I really think there are so many ways to do this when we're talking about social media. Maybe you can take all that B-roll that you didn't use, cut it into something called a sizzle reel. My business partner comes from production, so she actually taught me that term, so I'm teaching it to you too. And basically it's, a 10 to 15 second reel that highlights the best moments. It's almost like a trailer, but you can use it over and over and over. You're still laughing at sizzle reel, I love it.
No, I'm laughing because I have a very specific reason that I will tell them.
Okay, we'll tag it. But it's just one way, and if you have 4 people featured in a video, why not take each of their stories and look at the news? What's going on in the media? Is there something that you can proactively pitch right now? I mean, Angela said so many things are happening right now that we can probably all tie into at some point with one person's story or one testimonial or one quote. First line of an article, open with one of those stories. You just have to always assume, found one story, you met the journalist, cool, you found one story, but how am I going to tell that story at least 4 ways, always, always.
Katie, you kind of took my comment. I was going to say something about a sizzle reel because we reuse our footage a lot. We were super lucky at the Georgia Sports Hall just recently because Champ Bailey gave an amazing speech when he was inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. And as soon, I'm very fortunate that I've got a great relationship with Champ, and I knew that he was going to speak on it, and I called ahead and said, be sure that the second that hits social media, we're retweeting it, we're taking it and posting it on our Facebook pages and everywhere that we have a presence, because that was a very powerful speech, and I just knew that it was going to be. But yeah, I mean, yeah, like there's no, Nicole, you and I talked about, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You already have some resources. Like, look at what your past has, put it together, sizzle reel, montage, whatever you want to call it. You can actually reuse that stuff for a long, long time.
We do, and the reason I was laughing is so the way I ultimately ended up working in sports about 7 years ago, I think, I was speaking at the UN on World Brain Day, and I ended up meeting Lee Steinberg. And I worked with some athletes, but at that point, I had never really gotten into the concussion space in that way. And so what we ended up doing is he said, how would you like to host like a social good event during my Super Bowl party? So I went to the Super Bowl and held the first Brain Health Summit. Only like 10 people showed up because no one wanted to talk about concussions, brain injury. And so I made it about kids and about the future and super pro sport. And we had one photographer in the room, but she did some film and she did some photos, and she made it constantly look like there were at least 30 people in the room.
Hire her again.
I mean,
It
a
was
talented
awesome.
photographer
But so
can
then-
save you.
Right, but when you said like a social, like using that content, some of that looking way back at that first one, it looks like we had people really engaged and paying attention, and I probably shouldn't have owned up to it, like, only I knew looking out, like, oh, 10 people care about brain health. And now we actually have hundreds in the party now, it's like 3,000 people. But it took years of crafting that message, being very consistent with it, having individual stories, and engaging some years kids. In Minneapolis, since it was purple, we did women in sport. In Texas, we focused on veterans and military, and all that content that we reuse every year. And so I hadn't even thought about it. It's so brilliant.
And I think, there's something to be said about take the time to do it in a quality way. Spend the extra few dollars you have in your budget and hire a quality photographer or videographer. Because that's the foundation. Your marketing is your life. It's how you're going to get people through the door to donate. It's how you're going to get volunteers. It's how you're going to get your staff. And guess how we all get first impressions? The internet. What? I wasn't
Series
interwebs,
to series
but
of
it's
teams.
So since you mentioned interns and our staff, another thing I kind of want people to think about. So you probably have some pretty amazing people in your organization, right? Like, if it gets slow, a really nice thing to do for your volunteers is to pop up their stories, especially if they've got one that's engaging, right? I mean, you can put those things up everywhere, man. You can put that on their LinkedIn, right? So then everybody in their LinkedIn sees you giving a little shine to them and what they do. You may have a donor out there that's like, hey, I didn't know David did that. That's really interesting. Let me learn some more about that. So then you get some clickbait off of just recognizing somebody who's serving your organization. So you look great, your person looks great, you can bring some shine on them, and you might get some dollars in the door. And stuff like that is very inexpensive because we all have, where's my cell phone? Where's my smartphone? We all have this thing. Like, everybody's carrying this thing around.
Do it, talk behind it.
I do actually, because I didn't put it down when we were talking, so good thing that I did, like, it's a nice problem.
I thank you for saying the volunteer thing, because raise your hand if you have volunteered for an organization here. Anytime in your life in the past. Basically 100% of the room is raise your hand. How did you feel when your story, if I hope it got shared some way, was shared? Did you feel motivated to keep doing the good work? Did you feel a little prouder at the end of the day? I know, so I've been a volunteer at the Red Cross on and off staff, but mostly volunteer for the Red Cross nationally and internationally for almost 10 years. And I think, because I know this is a room of nonprofit, big-hearted, do-gooder people, we won't ever run out of empathy here. That is a good thing. However, it can be really hard to keep the mojo going if you're like, oh, I'm not doing enough, oh, I'm not reaching people up. But guess what? If somebody internally in your team, or you, as a founder with a very compelling story, I will give a shout out to Basket Brigade. I learned the entire story of why they came to fruition in less than 2 minutes, and you should talk to them because it's compelling. But not only is your morale raised, your team's morale is raised because of that one story, you're gonna get a huge ROI on that. Because if your team really cares about it, then people are gonna care enough to donate and become part of your cause.
That's great. So I just want to quickly draw attention. I know we're closing up on time, so I have more questions, but I guarantee some of you have very specific questions about your organization or things that you're working on. So I want to leave some time for Q&A if there are questions.
You got the after lunch crowd.
Oh, good. I have more questions.
I was waiting to see if anybody actually had any questions. I've actually just got a comment to kind of dovetail along with what you guys are talking about with communication and telling your story. There's a conference I went to in 2016 out in Colorado Springs called Advance Your Reach. And the guy's name that runs it is Pete Vargas III, and he is known as the stage whisperer. And the way you get more people, clients, donors, whatever it is that you're after, is by doing it from stage. Because if you've got 150 people of your ideal clients right in front of you, do you want to have 150 conversations? No, you want to have one. And so you do it from up there. So then you're sharing your story with all of these ideal clients all at once. And I know Pete, I've met him, I went to his conference. The guy knows what he's doing. So if you want to learn how to get on stage, you want to learn how to craft your story so that you can get more donors, I encourage you to look up Pete Vargas and Advance Your Reach.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for being here. Actually, Katie, I saw you speak at Spartus about a year ago, pretty similar. But can you talk about how you decide what should be done in-house versus hired expertise?
That's a great question.
Yes, there is a lot of debate about this. Where to spend the dollar, where not to spend the dollar, because the dollar is valuable thing. Think about where you are in your life cycle of your organization. Are you just starting out? Do you need the quality material that's going to take you far? If so, it might be worth it to spend on a production company or a very quality photographer. If you're at a point where it's for a very specific, like one event that you know is going to be super targeted, it's going to be impactful, or you're on the ground doing work that you want to show where's the donor dollar going, maybe a Facebook Live, you don't need a production team for that. But what are you trying to convey, right? What is the message and what is it that you want your people to do when they watch it? So I think answering those questions up front, and I have a whole workshop on this I do with my business partner, so happy to dive in and talk about that afterwards.
Well, you can also hire for that, and especially if you're hiring entry level, you know, even if it's like an office admin sort of person who's got some camera skills and some life in that world and some drive to do it, and you can bring that person along and up in your organization as a way of thanking them and a way of incentivizing them to do the real job properly by giving them the camera and letting them get to meet the impacted population base and things like that. You can really create a lot of loyalty and energy within your employees. If production value is not the be all and end all of your video, if you can give it to a younger person and really capitalize on that.
Another thing you can think about doing, and I say this as somebody who is currently serving on 4 boards. Listen, when you look at who's going to be on your board, look at 3 things: time, talent, and treasure. And that talent piece, if you really need a big production person, go find somebody in your community who is doing those big events. Ask them if they'd like to be on your board, and what they would like to contribute is the production piece. Because now all of a sudden, that person, that business owner, can use their association with your 501c3 as a marketing tool, and you have the free production that you actually want.
You really lay out a list of your needs and sort of create that Venn diagram of people who are left.
Oh, that's true. Your board is your team. And you want to be able to have those people do everything that you don't do.
Yes, ma'am.
And get your money. One of the main things is I hate doing videos. And I'm always hearing, you do 10 minutes or 10-second video. And I don't like to film myself talk.
You
Right?
feel real stupid, don't you?
Yeah.
I know.
That's what I say, right? So,
I'd much rather be here looking out at y'all than, right?
so
I get it.
and how do you film yourself to talk, and you have to have those angles, and let's say just be natural and give yourself 10, 15 seconds to talk. So when you start to do that type of thing, are you making yourself a production thing? Are you finishing cooking and then do a video, and then, you know, how do you prepare for something like that?
I drink. I mean, really serious. I normally have a glass of wine to like, and then I actually do it for, it probably takes like 10 takes before I'm comfortable. And it's not that the words are wrong, because I know what I'm saying, I wrote it. I just, it's all in my head. So really, I just kind of like put my nerves.
Glasses or three?
Depends on the day.
I think, it's different if you're a one-woman show, right? And it sounds like you are, so you don't have the option of saying, I'm gonna have our communications officer do that.
No, I do,
But
but
practice.
Yeah, it's
Got to
unnatural.
practice like everything
But
else. Practice.
I will say,
Do it by yourself. When no one else is watching.
I talk to myself. Seriously, no, like I really do. I look like an insane person in traffic because I'm always driving around and I'm practicing whatever it is that I need to be speaking about. And I'm doing like this while I'm driving. Like one day I'm gonna get pulled over and y'all are all gonna know why. But no, like, and the other thing I do that's kind of weird is I listen to a lot of heavy metal while I'm, you drink. I mean, what do you do?
but polish doesn't have to be the end of the story either,
Yeah.
right? Because the whole reason you're doing that is you're showing the human behind your brand. And that's what they really want.
Yeah.
So, it's like when you watch all the celebrity videos and you kind of like when they mess up because you're like, oh, they're like me when I've had a few glasses of wine, whatever.
You already did.
But don't worry about me. I identify with that third glass, but don't worry about being perfect because nobody expects it. And in fact, if it's too perfect, it might look a little,
Insincere.
yeah.
For the
Your authenticity matters.
for the more professional one, the one that you need to look really good, find a photographer or videographer that you connect with personally. A professional photographer's job is to get the subject to let his or her guard down. If you look at a serious portrait photographer or more intimate style of videographer, and if you can afford it, and hang with that person for 2 or 3 hours before the camera even starts rolling.
And also think of something that Angela said in her keynote about making the most of the platform you've got. I mean, keep in mind that the reason you're running this organization is because you're passionate about it. And if you're not doing it, who's going to do it? So think of it almost the way like you owe this to people.
Three glasses, I got you.
Last 2 questions. Great.
Is it weird that I'm gonna piggyback on that question because I, in my former life, was a photographer, and so I have another tip on that?
Hire her. See?
No.
We just figured it out.
I run a nonprofit now. So no, but if you visualize, if you're looking into the camera, even if it's just you with the iPhone watching, visualize who your audience is. Figure out who you're talking to exactly. And even like if there's someone in mind, a donor or something, picture that person instead of like you're looking at the camera lens in the little circle. Picture that person because when you talk to that person, it's gonna free you up to just your message is gonna be clear. You know what I'm saying? All right. Anyway, that was a preview. I have a question. So sideline USA, Christine Finalto. My question is regarding incentivizing your program users to share their stories. Okay, so my resources are offered online, and I'm with hurting athletes. So athletes who are not used to saying, hey, I'm hurting, and here are my issues. And so do you have any suggestions as far as ways that you could incentivize your program users to come out of the shadows online, using your website or using our social media? How can we incentivize them to come forward and share their stories? Recognizing there's a time and place for everybody because they're in process, so it takes some time for them to be in process before they're ready to share their story. But I'm just curious if you have any ideas for online or social media usages.
I like the idea of setting up a funnel. So all the people you touch, there's some way for them to enter into the funnel, whether you've got their email address, whether you ask them to fill out a survey monkey, whether they just call you because they're excited with the outcome of their progress in their work, and they self-identify as passionate and articulate, and they really enjoy being listened to, and feel that much more loyalty and attachment to the organization and the cause just by virtue of having been listened to. And from there, then you can winnow down to where you want to be.
I think it sounds like safety is a very big issue for your organization. And quite frankly, when somebody, because this is a very big campaign across many places right now, share your story. We want to hear from you, share your story, and there's a reason for that. But for somebody to really share the most emotional and impactful stories, they have to feel safe to do that, whether it's in front of the camera or a very scary dark hole on the internet. So my recommendation, and I've had quite a few campaigns fall flat from this and we learn from them, is that you have to make them feel like I'm connecting with one person, and who's that one person first? And it's maybe in private first, right? Submit your story here to this inbox. I'm monitoring it, our staff is monitoring. From there, you can vet and see what comes through and reach out to that person and say, hey, we'd love to hear more for 1 hour phone call. That's what producers do. They don't share everything live right away because nobody wants to give a story live right away. Some people do, I will say, some people do, and that's what social media is for. But the people that don't, that have the great stories, may want to feel like they're being supported at first.
Right.
So
Which we do, and then it's that tipping point is like, now I'm gonna ask them for something. And they're used to being, me reaching out to them and serving their needs, and they're hurting. So now, where's that threshold where I say, okay, now are you willing and able to come out and help somebody else? And if they're still in process, then that takes some time to
That's
work through.
exactly what I was gonna say to you, because you and I talked during lunch, and you know, I told you I've mentored a lot of student athletes. So I actually have had a couple of kids that were not physically hurt, but they were going through some emotional and mental anguish during season, which is, that's another issue that doesn't necessarily always get addressed in college athletics, right? Because nobody wants to be seen as soft.
Right.
So one young man that I was really working with, after he was finished, when he was ready, I said, listen, you know, when you won, he actually won the ESPN Grand Slam that year, and I'm like, when you won this, you know, you had a really low period. You actually almost did not get invited to this. And would you be willing to share your story? Because that's the kind of stuff that really moves people. Seeing that somebody who came, like, we all love a comeback story, right? I mean, this is a room full of sports fans. We all love a comeback story. And I think really as a human race, we still, even if we're not sports fans, that's something we can all identify with. Because everybody's been knocked down. They want to see that somebody else got back up so that they have some hope to do it themselves.
And to add quickly onto that, I use a very similar approach, and I love the way that you phrased it. And something you can add on the tail end is your story, quite frankly, may help somebody who is exactly in your position. When I'm in the middle of a disaster field, nobody wants to share their story about their house being gone and everything being down to ruins. But if I say, hey, your story may help somebody in the future or somebody now who's going through the same thing, would you be willing to share for that person?
Thank you.
All right, bring us home.
All right, my name is Donnell Osley. I'm trying to minimize. I'm in I guess a kid in a candy store right now as I learn. So my question and comment, my comment would be, obviously there are many stories to be told in different ways, and I really love the idea of impression story, where whether it be pictures, you know, finding out what is the best story you need to tell and how is critical. My question would be, can you talk a little bit about protecting your story as a company and a narrative? I would love to hear that.
Maintaining your brand is vitally important, and in this space, it is really easy for your message to get away from you, and we've seen that in everything from, you know, the NFL to, I recently went through this with one of my nonprofits, and it was a mistake, and someone tagged the wrong organization, and I woke up to a Twitter nightmare, right? It took 5 days to sort out. And by that point, it was a huge hit. So I'm actually equally interested in this, but your integrity is everything. Consistency is the one thing I would say.
Okay, so I don't always get out in the world and do good. Sometimes I work with lawyers. And right now is a time when I'm going to say, like, my legalese hat came out the second that you said that. So anything, I'm writing a book. So anything that I take from my book draft that I post on my Instagram, I put a little TM emoji on it. All right, and I've already queried it to several places. Like, that's a platform, like that's a thing. Okay, so that protects that emotion. But the thing is that you're pretty limited. But do understand that when you're putting something on the internet, you're very, very limited. And I am not an actual attorney. I am not an attorney. I just work with them. But you do have some limitations. But I will say that when you're looking at engagement of dollars for board members, attorneys are smart investments.
I'd like to say that depending on the exact circumstances you're talking about, like a nightmare like Nicole was describing, like you don't want that to happen. But to a certain extent, you do want members of the public to take your story and run with it. Like, that's what viral is. You want that. So to the extent that you can maintain your integrity and have your message maintain its integrity, but provide other people some ownership and be happy with the retweets and the rebrands and all that sort of thing. And people's comments they put on it, you may not always like, but the more they get out there, like, the better off you are, unless it is really a crisis situation like Nicole was talking
I
about.
like that word you use, though, creating ownership for everyone you want to engage. I like that a lot. Was that helpful?
Very.
All right, no one's shut us down, so one more, last question.
Yeah, we are a photo and video team.
We love you, in case you did not realize.
Well, you know, love has all kinds of descriptions. The words, we do about 150 nonprofit events a year, and the words I hate to hear are, you're the professionals, do what you think is right. Because it's your story, not ours. And a lot of times I think people who select video or photography or advertising groups are liking the glitz they saw someplace else, but not necessarily the most effective story, and it may not be the story you want to tell. So I think the first thing you have to do is you have to know what your message is, who the message is going to, and you have to give a lot of direction to the professionals. If they're really good, we'll do a good job of transcribing your thoughts and your goals into an effective story. But it's got to be your story, not ours. Don't be impressed with fancy transitions and glitzy titling and all that kind of thing. The question is, how effective is it going to be? And it won't be effective if it's great video, but it's not your story.
That was awesome, thank you. All right, please give a round of applause for this panel. I learned so much. And they're all sticking around for a little bit, so if you have more questions, they'll be here.
I didn't know you'd go up there.
What's that?
I didn't know you were going up there.
Neither did I. Boom.
That was me, sorry.
You're with Barack, right? With Barack's group?
I don't know with anybody.
What?
I don't know with anybody.
No?
No.
Just do this on your own?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Doing his thing. It's a cool gig.
You're doing it on your own?
Roy.
I think cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and then we'll do our last panel at 3:30.